Hello, everyone. Welcome. So glad that we can be together to worship today. You know, because of the internet, social media, we have this phenomenon over the last decade that is a relatively new thing in human history. When something suddenly explodes in visibility and you suddenly see it everywhere on your computer and your phone, we have a term for that. And a lot of you are already thinking of it. We say that thing has gone what? Viral. It's gone viral. Unfortunately, thanks to COVID, we understand too well what a good descriptor that word is. A virus spreads quickly, and that's what happens to some of the images that are shared online. One of my favorites was the monkey that used a man's camera to take a selfie. The only thing that bothers me about that photo is the realization that there is a monkey who takes better selfies than I do. Now, our smiles are a lot alike, but it kind of hurts to know he's better with a camera. Some other famous viral images include the Ellen DeGeneres Oscar selfie with Ellen, bunch of movie stars. There was the White House Situation Room photo taken during the raid of the bin Laden compound. But one of the most famous and certainly one of the most mysterious viral photos was simply known as the dress. And this one was crazy because we were all looking at the same image, but we were not all seeing the same thing. Now, I don't know if our video wall will change how the colors display, but let me just ask, how many of you see a black and blue dress? Raise your hand if that's what you see. Okay. How many of you see a white and gold dress like Jesus sees? This is so fascinating. One media outlet surveyed a couple million people and found basically what we just found out in this room. About 70% of people see a white and gold dress. About 25% of people see a black and blue dress. Some other people see some other colors that the 90% of us can't really understand. It boils down to how your brain processes color. Now, this one's tough for me because in reality, the dress is blue and black, in spite of what Jesus and I see. But the majority of people like me, they're just certain that the dress is white and gold. And when people whose brains process color differently begin discussing the color of this dress, it is hilarious to see people look at other people and ask, "What is wrong with you? How could you possibly think the dress is those colors?" Some people are confident that the other person is lying or that people have gotten together to punk or prank them. Bar fights have broken out over the color of the dress. Marriage counselors have been consulted over the color of the dress. Optometry appointments have been made over the color of the dress. But the debate over the color of the dress is less about vision and more about perspective. When people are looking at the same thing but seeing different things, the difference is perspective. And what shapes our perspective becomes very important. The importance of perspective is at the heart of the Bible passage that we're going to look at today. It's also at the heart of the emotion that I want us to explore and to wise up to during today's teaching. And you'll see what I mean in a few minutes. Now, there is an Old Testament book with an odd name. It's the fourth book of the Old Testament. It's near the front of our Bibles, and it's called the Book of Numbers. And the title of the book comes from the census that God told Moses to conduct. The book of Numbers records how many soldiers and priests and Levites the Israelites had. It spells out the responsibilities for each of the families or the tribes. It records some key events that take place between the time when God gave Moses the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai to the time when the Israelites enter and take control of the Promised Land. Now, just imagine how ready the Israelites were to occupy this land that God had promised them. Their ancestors had left their homeland centuries earlier, because a Hebrew named Joseph was in charge of Egypt during that time and during a famine. So they all migrated to Egypt, and they had it good there as long as Joseph was alive and in charge. But when Joseph died, a Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph, who didn't care about the Hebrews, enslaved them, made them slaves of Egypt. Well, several centuries passed before God told Moses, I want you to lead my people, the Hebrews, out of Egypt to a land that I'm going to give them. Pharaoh did not cooperate, didn't want to lose all that free labor. But God destroyed Pharaoh and his army after the Israelites crossed the Red Sea. Then they were in the wilderness, and they were, as the old hymn says, bound for the promised land. Well, in Numbers chapter 13, they arrive, and God wants them to send a reconnaissance team to check it out. Verse 1 of Numbers 13 says, the Lord now said to Moses, send out men to explore the land of Canaan, the land I am giving to the Israelites. Send one leader from each of the 12 ancestral tribes. So Moses did as the Lord commanded him. He sent out 12 men, all tribal leaders of Israel, from their camp in the wilderness of Paran. By this point, the Israelites have seen God provide in a lot of ways. They had witnessed God leading them by a miraculous cloud that went before them at day and a ball of fire that led them when they were moving at night. And they had seen God provide bread and meat and water in miraculous ways. Every day, they received what they needed from God's hand. And notice that God is not encouraging them to think that they might be able to conquer this new land. He doesn't ask them to conduct a feasibility study. And when he refers to Canaan, this new land, God says, this is the land I am giving to them. So God is not asking them to visit the maybe land or the possibly land or the fantasy land. God is saying, this is the place I have decided, this is the land I am promising to you, the promised land. It's important for us to remember all this as the backdrop for what we're about to read. And it's important for us to notice how God responds when we wonder whether or not something is possible after God has already promised it. Last year, my wife and I wanted to spend some time with my daughter and her husband. We had been with our son and his wife more than with our daughter and her husband, so we planned a getaway. And I made the arrangements because I like doing that. But you know what last year was, right? Like 2020. And our trip got 2020'd. 2020 did not cooperate. Some things here at home needed our attention. So about a week before the trip, I told our daughter and her husband that we could not make it. And my daughter responded well. She didn't say, hey, we've already taken vacation. You're really letting us down. What kind of a father are you? She said, that's okay. We can do a staycation here in Denver where they live. I said, no, I've been telling you guys about this for months. I've shared details to help you get excited about the trip. I feel like I made a promise, so I want you and Seth to go. I've canceled our hotel room. Your hotel room is still booked. I was going to rent a car, so I'll pay for your rental car. All I ask is that you send some pictures so we can see and enjoy what you're up to. So my daughter and her husband and my money had a nice little getaway. And we got some nice pictures and no t-shirt. Here's the thing. In my mind, I had made a promise. And even though things changed for me, and even though things changed, I wanted to keep my promise. If my daughter had texted me and said, well, we don't have money for the hotel, so we're not going to take the trip, I would have said, wait a minute, I've promised to cover the hotel. If she had texted and said, you know, it's the pandemic, rental cars are really pricey right now, we're not going to go, I would have said, but wait, I promised that I would cover the car. I don't want my children to doubt what I have promised. And if I feel that way, as an imperfect father with limited resources, how much more does God feel that way when He is the perfect father with unlimited resources. God promised that the land of Canaan would be the new home for the Israelites. In fact, he first made that promise centuries earlier, and even though a lot had changed, a lot had transpired, in God's mind, the promise was still valid. It was still in force. In God's mind, the title for the promised land had already been transferred. It was a done deal. He referred to it as their land. In fact, God used some of the same terms that we use when we buy property or a house. He told them to take possession of the land. And notice the language. It's already theirs. They just had to step into it. And all they had to do was follow God's instructions. And all the things that God had done daily to provide for them should have been their assurance that as they stepped into this land, that God would keep his promise and it would be theirs. And that is why what happens next is so disappointing. Moses gives the 12 men selected to explore the land some instructions. He tells them, I want you to note the quality of the soil. I want you to note the number of inhabitants, the extent of the fortifications. He tells them, I want you to bring back samples so that the other Israelites will be able to see that this land is fertile and desirable, that it's going to be a great place for us to live. So the 12 spies who take this reconnaissance mission, they do that. And they witness that the land is amazing. And they bring back a cluster of grapes that is so large, it has to be tied to a pole and 2 men have to carry it. That's a large cluster of grapes. And they bring pomegranates and figs, and they come home and report, this place is amazing. But they also report on things that concern them. There were already people living in the land. It was not unoccupied. It belonged to someone else. And in verse 28 of Numbers chapter 13, the report from the spies takes a pessimistic turn when one of the 12 spies says this: the people living there are powerful, and their towns are large and fortified. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. Giants. How are we normal-sized Israelite men supposed to defeat armed Bigfoots who live in well-fortified cities? Well, one of 2 spies who believed that the land was already theirs because God had promised it, saw the sentiment of the crowd beginning to trend in the wrong direction. And he could see that the people were losing heart. So in verse 30 of Numbers 13, we read, Caleb tried to quiet the people as they stood before Moses. Let's go at once to take the land, he said. We can certainly conquer it. So you've got 10 out of 12 spies saying, there's no way we can do this. You've got 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, saying, we can do this, not because we're awesome, but because God has promised us this land. He has told us to take it. But in verse 31, the naysayers reply to Caleb. But the other men who had explored the land with him disagreed. We can't go up against them. They are stronger than we are. You know what's odd about this is he's not wrong. They were stronger than the Israelites. They just weren't stronger than the Israelites and God. And these 10 of the 12 spies become more dramatic in their warnings. They tell the people, the land will devour us if we try to conquer it. And they say, these giant warriors, they made us feel like grasshoppers, and they mocked us for being so small. And even without Twitter, this pessimistic group of 10 spies spreads these negative rumors and reports. And before long, hundreds of thousands of Israelites, maybe millions, have shared these reports. And they conclude as a people, it would be suicide for us to try to conquer this land, the promised land. Friend, this is a good place in the story for us to stop and ask a question. I'll ask it in the first person because it's a question I need to ask of myself. It's a question that you need to ask of yourself. Here's the question. does it matter to me what God has promised? Does it make any difference to me when God has promised something? When you realize that God has made a promise, does it change your expectations, your viewpoint, your confidence? Or is it just a religious concept that you never internalize? Well, God said something, that's religious. What does that have to do with me? The thing I want us to wise up to today is fear. And the question I'm asking is, how many promises has God made that directly correspond to your fears? How many fears are you allowing to occupy the space in your head and in your heart and in your life about which God has made promises? When a fear pushes its way into your consciousness, requires you to become aware of it, do you ever require yourself to stop and consider that fear in light of what God has promised? If you are afraid of dying, which is a pretty big deal, have you tested that fear in the environment of the promises that God has made about death? If you're afraid of not having enough money to live, have you evaluated that fear in light of what Jesus has said about seeking his kingdom and God providing for us when we do that? King David had a lot of enemies, people who wanted to take him out. But David wrote, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" David is using this logic that you can only use if you know and trust God. There are a lot of things that I could fear, but I am going to evaluate every fear in light of the promises that God has made. If God is my stronghold, who is stronger than him? If God is my light, what darkness can overtake me? Now, maybe you're thinking, well, Eddie, that's David. He's an Old Testament king, and that's the Old Testament age, and God has not spoken to me personally through a prophet in the way that he did to David. Okay, I hear you. So let's go from the Old Testament to the New Testament, the New Covenant, which is for you and for me in Jesus Christ. Romans 8:31 reminds us, if God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? So tell me, friend, what fear do you face that is not weakened or completely undone by that promise? If you don't have a need that God is unwilling to provide for you, why are you afraid? Why am I afraid? If God gave his one and only Son to take care of our deepest and eternal need, is there anything he won't do for us? Now, we sometimes confuse our needs and our wants, but God has never not provided for our needs. That verse does not say, and it does not mean that you and I will not face hardships and challenges, that our faith won't be tested. I mean, we want to believe sometimes that that's what it means, and I know there are teachers and preachers who tell us that's what it means, but anyone who is living with his or her eyes open knows that it is not the case that we get to skip the hardships. Jesus said that you and I will have trouble in this world, and the word he used for trouble is a word that actually conveys weight, burdens. So there are going to be times, and some of you are in one of those times today. There are going to be times when you feel the weight of life's burdens on you. There are times when I feel it. I don't get a pass either. Sometimes the weight of trouble requires you to cancel a getaway with your adult kids. Sometimes the weight of trouble requires you to cancel all your plans for the foreseeable future. Sometimes it is the weight of loss and grief. Sometimes it's the weight of criticism and disapproval. Sometimes it's the weight of disease and treatment. Sometimes it's the weight of having little. Sometimes it's the weight of broken relationships or loneliness. Jesus was upfront about the fact that you and I will feel the weight on us in this world. But this candidness from Jesus comes with a comfort from Jesus. These problems come with a promise. Jesus said, I have told you all this so that you may have peace. Look at the next two words, in me. A lot of us want peace, but we're not seeking it in him. Here on earth, Jesus said, you will have many trials and sorrows. That's probably the one thing we wish Jesus had not said, huh? But take heart, because I have overcome the world. The world is going to be a difficult place for you, Jesus said, just like the world was a difficult place for him. But, good news, I've overcome the world. So I want to spend the next few minutes that we have together offering you two warnings that come out of this story in the Old Testament and that relate to our lives and our fears. First, beware the certainty of the majority. The passage we read of the report given by the 12 spies is recorded in chapter 13 of Numbers. The following chapter, Numbers 14, has a heading in most modern translations. Now, the heading is supposed to be a preview of what you're about to read in that chapter. And the heading for Numbers 14 is, "The People Rebel." So, do you see the sequence of events? The spies come back, and 10 of the 12 spies say, in spite of the fact that it's the promised land, it's the problem land as far as we're concerned. There are lots of people there. They're mean. They're big. We can't do it. We'll get killed. We should think of another plan. Let me read the other plan that they come up with. This is the first 4 verses of Numbers chapter 14. Then the whole community began weeping aloud, and they cried all night. Their voices rose in a great chorus of protest against Moses and Aaron. Boy, it's fun to be a leader at a time like that, right? If only we had died in Egypt or even here in the wilderness, they complained. Why is the Lord taking us to this country only to have us die in battle? Our wives and our little ones will be carried off as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to return to Egypt? Then they plotted among themselves, let's choose a new leader and go back to Egypt. Now you remember, Egypt is where they were slaves. Egypt is the place they had asked God many times to deliver them from. Why are they saying this? You know why. You can hear the fear in their words. Listen, if you are all about the majority rule and democracy, if you are all about the court of public opinion, then you have to conclude that the Israelites should have abandoned their plans to conquer that land and should have gone back to Egypt. When 10 out of 12 spies says, yeah, the land is great, we've seen it, but there are giants and we should not go. We should have just stayed in Egypt as slaves. I mean, that's like 4 out of 5 dentists recommending sugarless gum for their patients who chew gum. If you don't understand, ask somebody who's 40 or 50 years old or older. Friend, when the majority of people don't know God, don't trust God, then the majority will want to do things that do not honor God. To be honest, I think the odds of someone speaking to you and me faithfully on God's behalf in our culture are probably about the same odds that the Israelites had with the spies, about 2 in 12. If you round up, that's about 17%. That might be generous. Most people, the majority of people, are with the 10 spies who said no. We shouldn't believe God. We shouldn't obey God. We shouldn't trust that what God says is going to be true. And that's why chapter 14 says they're in rebellion against God, because they are not seeking him. There are people who try to portray God as agreeing with him when God doesn't agree with them. But if they're in the majority, we are much more likely to believe it. So their perspective is skewed. Their sense of right and wrong is self-driven instead of God-driven. If you let the majority tell you how to think and what to believe and how to live, you're in trouble. Because God is often speaking through the 2 and not the 10. The second warning I want to offer us is to beware the certainty of self. Now, if you can't believe the majority, and if you shouldn't believe yourself, who should you believe? That's a great question. You know the answer, don't you? Jesus said, trust in me. Trust in me. The Bible says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding, but that's what we're leaning on. We're leaning on our viewpoints, our opinions, our perspective, our idea of what should be right and wrong. We're leaning on our own understanding. Our entire world has had a lesson in humility over the last 18 months. We are accustomed to seeing less developed nations struggle against disease, but we have received a painful, long-term reminder that we should not think so highly of ourselves, that we cannot handle all of our own problems. The Bible is full of reminders that confidence in ourselves is a dangerous thing. In Isaiah 55, verse 9, God says, as the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways. My thoughts are higher than your thoughts. God is saying, you think you're right, but I'm right. You think you're living the best way, but I know the best way for you to live. So while we tell ourselves that we have learned a lot and we can do a lot and we know a lot, God is saying, not just to believers, but to people everywhere, that we should stop trusting ourselves so much and begin trusting him. A friend told me about a dating site that asks a unique question. It asks the people who are registering to find a date whether or not they believe their intelligence qualifies them as a genius. And as it turns out, a lot of geniuses are looking for dates. However, one gender answered the question, do you think you're a genius, at a higher rate than the other gender. And women, I'll bet you instinctively know which gender is more likely to think of itself as a genius. Guys, I want you to sit this one out, but I just want the women to verbally respond to me when I ask this question. Women, are men or women more likely to think they are geniuses? What's the answer? I've been listening all day for women. I haven't heard it yet. Now, if you're wondering whether or not, by the way, it is men. If you're wondering whether or not I would have asked the men to answer that question if the results had actually gone the other way, the answer is no way. Do you know why? I'm a genius. Hey, listen, I know self-esteem is a real problem with some people. There are people who think less of themselves than they should. They don't realize they are created in God's image. They don't realize they are loved by the creator of the universe, that they have been rebought, repurchased, saved by the Son of God. They don't realize they matter to God and matter to the rest of the human race because they are created by God and have a God-given purpose. Some people don't realize how valuable they are, how much they have to offer, how much would be missing from this world if they weren't part of it. That's a real thing. But the pandemic in our world is not low self-esteem. It is exaggerated self-esteem. We think we are smarter than we are. We think we are more noble than we are. We think we are more consistently good than we are. We think we are more selfless than we are. We think we are more humble than we are because we are not humble enough. And if you want something legitimate to fear, if you want something that you should be afraid of, here it is. Be afraid of trusting the majority, and be afraid of yourself. Be afraid of trusting your views, your opinions, and your desires more than you trust the God who made you and can show you what you should think and how you should live. Be afraid of concluding that having what you want is much more important than doing what God wants. Wise up to how great God is. Wise up to how flawed you are. Wise up to fear that the evil one uses to manipulate you through the majority and sometimes through yourself.